All right, so we continue to track the ongoing partial government shutdown as Washington remains deadlocked over funding and immigration enforcement policy. The White House saying President Trump has not had direct talks with Democratic leaders recently, even as pressure grows over the effects on TSA, the Coast Guard, FEMA, and other operations. The Washington Examiner's Christian Datoc is here. He's been reporting on the standoff and the White House response to it. Okay, so the White House says that President Trump has not had direct conversations with Democratic leadership recently. This comes even though he said last week that he expected to get personally involved in the talks. Based on what you're hearing, Christian, what does personal involvement look like inside the White House?
Well, when it comes to President Trump, personal involvement is very simple to define. It's him quite literally working the telephones. We know President Trump is a night owl. He's frequently posting on Truth Social, and in these big legislative pushes, he's again calling Mike Johnson, interacting with Democratic leaders, Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer. But if you take Caroline Leavitt at her word from the briefing earlier today, he hasn't done that. And like you mentioned, this runs contrary to what the president told us last week before he departed Washington. So I'm not exactly sure what he's waiting for. Based on my sourcing inside the White House, this has been a priority for him. And it's an issue that he had hoped to have resolved before next week's State of the Union. That being said, Donald Trump has never been one to legislate in a conventional manner. So maybe he's got something up his sleeve at the moment.
Yeah, State of the Union on Tuesday. We've been tracking this shutdown closely. By the way, the majority of lawmakers not on Capitol Hill. They're on a break right now. This shutdown is unusual, Christian, in that it's focused on a single department. And Democrats have tied their funding position to demands for new restrictions on immigration enforcement operations. If both sides are presumably looking at this from a pragmatic perspective, what's keeping a deal from coming together right now?
Well, from a policy standpoint, there's a lot. And we sort of discussed that last week. We know Democrats have put forward a wealth of demands for reforms within ICE and Border Patrol. And we talked about them again. The requirement to make officials show photo and name identification plates, the banning of masks for immigration officers, and of course, the major red line requiring immigration officers to obtain judicial warrants before carrying out any of their enforcement actions. But politically, that's sort of a little bit of a different story, because I think if you look at what Hakeem Jeffries told folks on Capitol Hill on Wednesday, this is a major win for Democrats if the shutdown can extend to next Tuesday's State of the Union. I do believe ultimately that a deal will be reached, but it certainly won't be a good look for Donald Trump and congressional Republicans if they're up on Capitol Hill next Tuesday with command of both the White House and both chambers of Congress. Meanwhile, some of these critical agencies within DHS remain shuttered. Now, you did mention FEMA and TSA just a second ago. Those are two operations which, in theory, should be continuing their work. TSA officers are working at airports without pay, but those paychecks go out and come early March. And if this shutdown extends, beyond just the 10 days where Congress is in recess following last week's final vote, I do think you're going to see more pressure on the White House to really move this thing along. Now, when it comes to FEMA, they actually had a big announcement earlier in the day on Wednesday. They have paused all non-essential travel to disaster zones for agency officials. This is a major development, considering most of that funding is still ongoing. It comes from FEMA's Emergency Relief Fund, not necessarily the wider appropriations for the agency and the department writ large.
Yeah, so Caroline Leavitt did take to the podium today. We had a White House press briefing earlier this afternoon. The press secretary has said that Democrats are responsible for the shutdown, while Democrats are arguing that they're seeking changes that they say are necessary before approving funding. When you look at the negotiations and the recent offers on both sides, what is the fairest way to describe how this stalemate came to be?
Well, wow, you kind of put me on the spot. I don't know if I can describe it succinctly, but I would say that both sides are really taking hardline positions. Now, we had heard a lot from President Trump following the Alex Preddy shooting about recognizing both mistakes that ICE and CBP have, committed in the field, and trying to listen to the concerns of Americans about how the deportation agenda is being implemented. But again, the White House has been virtually totally resistant to any of the reforms that Democrats have put forward. Democrats on the other side of this thing, haven't really budged off their initial position. We just outlined what all those demands were. But ultimately, I do think the ball is sort of in the Republicans' court at this point in time, considering that the two major agencies that are being targeted here, ICE and CBP, they got oodles of funding in the president's One Big Beautiful Bill last summer. I think the top line for ICE funding in that package was something like $76 billion. That's roughly 7 times more than they usually receive from Congress in the annual appropriations process. So their operations haven't stopped at all during this limited shutdown. So ultimately, Democrats are going to have to say, do we risk undercutting some of those other agencies in DHS to try and prove a point to the nation and to the White House? Or do we lessen our demands a little bit and try and find some common ground on reforms that the White House might actually be willing to embrace here?
So let's reiterate something. For people watching at home, we've covered this. I'm hoping we can expand on it. The most immediate impacts, from what I've read, are what happens at airports and in emergency and security operations, including TSA screening and Coast Guard missions continuing without pay. Moving forward, Christian, is there a way we can measure how disruptive this partial shutdown is becoming? Do we expect it will be?
Well, I think the major impact on Americans across the country will certainly be felt at airports. Now, if you think back to last year's shutdown, there was all the talk about how the FAA had to shut down and cancel flights because operators weren't showing up without their paychecks. That won't necessarily happen this time around because those air traffic controllers are funded through the FAA and DOT. That being said, security lines will be a nightmare. Again, TSA officials are set to receive their first paycheck that will be affected by the shutdown come March. And when I say receive it, they'll be going without pay in just a few weeks. So some of those officials might end up calling out sick or skipping work altogether because, let's be honest, these officials have to pay the bills as well. They might have to be taking up gig work or second jobs just to pay their rent or their mortgage, put food on the table for their families. So that is where the immediate impact will be felt. I also expect some some disaster operations at FEMA to, again, be paused until the government is fully funded. Now, I'm not saying something like a hurricane or a severe flood or even the avalanche response that we just were talking about before I came on the program. That will go on unimpeded. But it's situations that we're seeing, like in Los Angeles, the rebuilding effort from those horrible wildfires in late 2024, and even some of the work that's ongoing in East Palestine, some 3 years after that train derailment. Those items and projects are essentially going to be put on pause until Democrats and Republicans can find common ground and pass this wider funding bill.
Given what you're hearing from sources, is there anything to indicate that we might see an agreement on DHS funding made before the State of the Union?
At this point in time, I'd be really surprised, Austin. Again, both sides are really entrenched in those positions that they alliterated, last week before the shutdown even started. So if you take Hakeem Jeffries at his word, I think this will at least go on until next Tuesday, if not next Wednesday morning, even though Congress is set to return to D.C. on Monday.
All right. Christian Datoc covers the White House for the Washington Examiner. Good to see you. Thanks.
Anytime.